If you look up the difference between poetry and prose, or even just ask people, there seems to be a pretty obvious line in the ground as to where one stops and the other begins and vice versa. Probably for everyday writing like memos and class notes, etc., that's totally fair. But I find the line really begins to fade when you're dealing with stories. And perhaps even more so with oral stories and very short fiction like flash fiction, which is often interchangeable with prose poetry. And while we're on that topic, if you look up poetry and prose, or even just the use of poetic techniques in prose, basically the only thing that pops up is prose poetry. Which, while Wikipedia might admit that prose poetry should be considered as neither primarily poetry nor prose, but is essentially a hybrid, it also says prose poetry is poetry written in prose instead of using verse, but preserving poetic qualities such as heightened imagery and emotional effects. So maybe instead of a line, it's more of a Venn diagram, with written poetry on one side, memos and all the other everyday prose on the other, and parts of written stories, many performance poems, pieces of oral stories, and prose poetry in the middle. There is a difference between poetry and prose, but to find the shade of gray where the crossover happens seems to be nigh impossible. The place between a novel and a poem seems to be in degrees based on the amount of poetic devices used in the description. And maybe that's because it's so hard to tell stories the way you want them to be told. As a writer, we come up against a lot of problems such as tone and wording not having the correct effect, or a scene not fitting the voice of a larger piece. Sometimes the through line or metaphor of the story is not understood by the reader, or worse, the reader just doesn't care.
There's the saying that the truth isn't the truth is a lie, and lying is more truthful than telling the truth. What you want to do is just emphasize the immediacy of the moment, and if people aren't there, you need to use hyperbole to exaggerate it, to make them, to place them there more immediate. Anyone can just tell you a story. There's hundreds of thousands of people with stories like this. The gift that you're trying to give to an audience, or the idea you're trying to impart, is you're trying to give it in a way that's going to make these people feel and empathize with even more than they would in real life. So if I sat down and I just told you the problem, that's one thing, but it's another thing to
emotionally instead of just intellectually engage.
Yeah, and so what you try to do is engage the senses and with give concrete sense details, because that's something that every human being on Earth has, and so then they can empathize more readily because they're put into a state where they are led to see and kind of engage with in a more heavy-duty way, like a more immediate way. You could just tell a story, or you could try to underscore how ridiculous it is with poetic technique. That's all poetic technique is good for. I mean, there's only so many stories. There's like 50 stories that humans can tell. So the only thing that sets them apart is the language in which they're rendered.
So the use of poetry in a longer prose piece is that it allows us to separate our voice and story from the countless other tellings. After all, most tales follow one of just a handful of archetypal stories, only with different characters in a different place. And beyond trying to be different, attention to rhythm and audio detail can allow a writer to take a piece of description or dialogue that isn't working and make it flow. Even novels that aren't obviously poetic in nature often use an artist's pickiness and grasp of word choice and rhythm.
And we always say with description that you look for the telling detail, the one detail. But the problem is, what she notices is all the details. So I knew I wanted all these things just coming at her, and it starts visually. You go through the senses, and as her trip goes on, you hear things. So you see things, and you hear things, and you smell things. It gets darker. And so what I did was I wrote a list of all the things that she might have seen. And I laid them on a table and I looked for patterns. Trinkets and toys and DVDs, magazines, neckties and nectarines. That's a bum bum boom. That's a back and forth, right? So you've got HHPP, right? Yeah. You've got a soft H, and then you've got a hard P. Hustlers and hawkers and hustlers pockets, and so you have the P and H sound. I think the elements. I think a lot of poetic language is justified after the fact. Like you do it because it sounds good, and later you say, "Well, what I was doing." In this case, it was a little more conscious because I tried just writing it, and it didn't work. I tried just writing as you would. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this isn't going to work. So that's one paragraph, I probably spent 3 days on it. And I had all these index cards. I wrote a single item on each. So flip-flops was on one row. Mm-hmm. Alarm clocks was here. Toilet seats. And I had laid it all over the table.
Little cards, eh?
Yeah, little index all over the house. And I would move them around. And it took me forever before I slowly started to find patterns. But hopefully when a reader reads a passage like that, they don't notice they're not going, ooh, alliteration, ooh, assonance. Ooh.
Yeah.
They just feel it flows.
I mean, everything is by degrees. It's really difficult to say, like, oh yeah, I definitely do it in this book, but I don't do it for this whole book. Hopefully in the novel somewhere there's sense detail and there's poetic language and there's alliteration, hyperbole, you know. Because a novel, people have a certain mindset when they're reading it. It's more driven by plot than a poem, which is driven by a central image usually. So you're going to use them more or less in those, but I don't think it's like yes or no. It's just a degree thing, and it's a degree for different writers. Some writers, like McLeod, uses tons of poetic language in his novels. He's definitely not a poet. I don't think he's ever written a poem. But then you have people that are like not poetic at all in their writing.
Things like Harry Potter doesn't have exactly very much poetry going on in it.
It's more narrative driven, and that's totally fine. It's not a right or wrong question. It's just like, what's your medium? Who are you engaging with? What are you talking about? And then you just try to draw the right amount of things. I have stories, for instance, about having sex on Second Life on my CD. There's not much room for poetic devices in that, other than exaggeration, because, I mean, it's a comedy story. It's basically a stand-up bit. So then, you know, it just doesn't, you can't just start telling a metaphor and you kind of lose some of the impact. So I think comedians use words like fuck more because it's just funny and it's used like, you use it, you know, just a funny word. They use it a lot more, a lot of swearing, than a poet does who's not going for that same effect, you know?
I wanted it to have a lyrical quality. I wanted the book to feel.
Yes, poetic.
And but you'll probably have noticed that there's different diction for different stories.
In different stories,
so,
yeah.
Amina's story is probably a little bit more lyrical. Namdi's is more earthy, and Laura's is more clinical. And I wrote each part of the book separately. And I kind of mixed them. So I wrote them with different vocabulary, different diction, different flow. And you may have noticed that Laura's world is very thin and very expository, and Namdi's is very earthy.
Yeah.
And Amina's is probably the most poetic, the girl walking.
The girl walking, yeah.
So.
The way a poem or novel flows on the page so that there are no jarring sections and it just lays out in front of a reader without effort is entirely craft-based. It is an instinctual or hard-practiced effort, and it is super important in keeping a reader engaged or focused rather than lost with every little distraction outside of the book. This flow can be achieved with just word rhythm and intrigue from the plot, or from the delicate use of rhyme and poetic technique.
Well, you can break poetic or choice of language down by lots of things. You know, whether there's internal rhyme, or classic rhyming, or there's assonance or alliteration. But really, you don't do that consciously. You just want a rhythm.
Like writing a novel, for instance, it's like a lot about rhythm. Because I feel like that's pretty much a lot of the voice in a story is the correct.
Yeah.
Given what we've heard and seen, using a degree unit instead of a line or even a Venn diagram is probably the most accurate way to explain the difference between the schools of writing. Hyperbole and poetic language can bring an audience into a story that may otherwise be apathetic to. Poetry can lull readers or listeners into a mindset where they're more open to empathize with situations and characters. In description, a mix of poetry and prose can evoke powerful images in new ways without being excessively dense or wordy. This makes sense, because well-done description is to the point, sense-driven, easy to understand, and flows well. These characteristics are vital in good poetry and in good prose, and that's why the use of both techniques blend together well to form exceptional storytelling.